Welcome back, everybody. It is now my pleasure to introduce Aaron Maniam. I will not go into his biography because the conference book sums it up very nicely. So rather than talk about his activities and his accomplishment, I will tell you some things about Aaron that you may not know. Aaron's father is half Indian, half Eurasian, and his mother is half Pakistani and half Malay. So it is not surprising that Aaron developed into a polymath who was deeply interested in many different fields of human activities. Aaron is a natural left-hander, but he has learned to write with his right hand as well. And the remarkable thing is that he uses each hand for different purposes to trigger different parts of his brain. Aaron is a poet who realizes that not all the pieces he writes are good, but as he says, they're all necessary pieces. You need to write them to get to the next one. I know Aaron because of his interest in complexity. I'm not quite sure that I remember precisely when we met for the first time, but once we have met, we kept keeping reasons to meet and we have become friends. Aaron has a very good understanding of the way complexity works and what it means for innovation in government. Amongst others, it means that you must have patience, and very importantly, you should not care about who gets the credit. I think a third one is to realize that there are many overlapping timescales in public policy. That's what Aaron will talk about. So please welcome Aaron to the stage.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Jan, for that very, very kind introduction and for the invite to come in and speak with and all of you today. I wanted to talk about this idea of timeframes in public policy, and where I wanted to start was probably a place you might not have expected me to start, at least not most of you. But a few months ago, I gave a very short talk at the museum you're all going to visit this afternoon, and Honor was very kind to host that. And in it, I reflected a little bit on Formula One and its link to the planning processes that exist in government. Now, Formula One is, as many of you will know, right, this major racing event that takes place every year in a whole bunch of different locations. We're quite proud of the Singapore race. That's the picture on the left, top left there is the figure 8, that is the track of our Formula One. So unlike many other tracks which goes in circles, ours goes in 8s, and the drivers find it deeply confusing and actually slightly discombobulating to work with. It's a tricky track. It also goes anti-clockwise rather than clockwise, so that makes the driving even more difficult. And it's an event each year that calls for significant amounts of operational detail, particularly for a place like Singapore because we do it on roads. We don't have a dedicated track. We work with the existing roads, and that means that lots of parts of government, the Land Transport Authority, the police, the Urban Redevelopment Authority, all come and get involved in this activity. What's interesting about it, though, is I got put into this job partly because I had too much fun in my career before that. Before that, I worked a little bit on strategic futures, thinking about long-term planning and how the government needed to adjust to the big trends that were out there and the kinds of things that we needed to do today in response to those trends. A lot of the things that Peter Ho talked about yesterday. And after that job, I got told by one of my bosses, okay, we know you can do all this sexy stuff, but can you do the normal work of government, right? The normal, mundane stuff that involves getting roads ready for big races and that involves operations and working with details, right? Dealing with the press and that sort of thing. And so this job was in a lot of ways a test. But because I'm slightly rebellious, I figured that I shouldn't just take this job and assume that it was necessarily different from planning. And so I went and ferreted around and spoke to a whole bunch of different people. And eventually I found one of the teams at Formula One. I will not name them for purposes of corporate confidentiality. But I spoke to them a little bit about their processes. And what I realized was that there were huge parallels between foresight, the process of planning, and what actually goes into race preparation. And a lot of that boils down to the issue of time, which made this a very natural talk for this conference. And this particular team split up times into 3. Right? They said that they deal with 3 levels of time. So we're going here into some of the perception issues of time that many other speakers have already alluded to. They have race time, first of all. Race time being that time that the driver is in charge, and during the race, what they have to do. Those split-second decisions about when they turn, how sharply they turn, do they accelerate, when do they do a pit stop, when do they get their wheels changed. All those small micro decisions that can add up to wins or losses in each race. Right? So that's the immediate urgency of race time. And then they have what they call real time. Real time being the part of the process where teams come in and say, all right, the race is over. How now do we adjust the work that we are doing? Right? How do we redesign the car? What minor tweaks can we make? Can we change the material on some of our tires? What do we do to change the drills and the processes and sequences for how we go about changing our equipment? That's real time. Right? So not in the race, but still within, say, the year of races. They can't change everything about their equipment, but they try and adjust the things that they can. And then a third aspect is what they call design time. Now this is a much longer term time frame. And this time frame is the one where they say, all right, the race cycle is over for the year. Let's reflect, let's learn from what went wrong and what went right. How do we adjust our processes a little bit more? Here's the bit where they say, can we fundamentally redesign cars? Can we use a new software? Can we get new algorithms that work for the software and the material that goes into each of the car designs? And all three of them are important, right? Design time alone is not useful if it doesn't translate into changes that manifest themselves in real time and race time. And race time and real time provide lessons and insights and data which feed into the process of design time. So this made me very happy because I realized that this new job that I was in was not entirely separated from the broader policy planning processes which I had so enjoyed in the earlier parts of my career. So what I wanted to talk about today was three things, right? First of all, lessons from Formula One and the kinds of time frames similar to race time, real time, and design time that exist in the public policy world. But then I wanted to push that a little bit further as well and ask ourselves, are these time frames actually embedded in a much larger series of time frames? And then finally look at some implications for public policy and for ourselves in terms of how we live our life. Okay, so this is just a rough outline of where we're going to today. Let me start with this first section on lessons from Formula One and the time frames that exist in public policy. Because I think there are actually three almost direct parallels between the world of Formula One and the world of public policy. Race time corresponds to what we like to call in government the world of operations, or ops, for those of you who are from government. And this involves things like crisis management or logistics, right? Things that have very short time frames where responses need to be extremely quick and extremely accurate. And if they're not, then they need to at least be very open and very honest. Because that's how you manage crises and logistics as best as possible. Real time corresponds to what we like to call the planning phase. Right? This is the planning and policy formulation phase, where governments are interested in how we optimize across resources. This is a period where efficiency becomes key as we analyze through cost-benefit analysis what is the best course of action to respond to particular types of situations. And I'll go through some examples after this. Design time is, I think, a good correspondent to the world of strategy. Right? This is the bit of our work where we're thinking about long-term trends and scenarios and what could be happening out there. Futures, which again was something we talked a bit about yesterday. And in this phase, not just efficiency is important, but we think about resilience being important. How does a system survive and continually improve itself as it changes and evolves? So let's go through some examples, right? Just two examples that I think can illustrate quite nicely what exactly the different phases are about. First of all, we have this thing we call the Pioneer Generation package, right? And this was something that the government put in place to recognize those people who had contributed particularly to the initial years of nation building in Singapore. Now at the operational level, right, at the logistical level, we actually have a system of a large number of Pioneer Generation ambassadors. So not government people, but people who come and volunteer, who went out to houses to talk to these people who by now are between 70 and 90 years old. And speak to them, find out what their needs were, help them understand what these packages were and what new subsidies they could have in their healthcare, what new, what we call small amounts of disbursements of funds were going to them, kind of in a sense, a recognition for the work that they had done so early on in our nation building. But people often think that the pioneer generation ambassadors just exist by themselves. They don't. They actually are the logistical arm of a much larger set of policies. And that's at the planning phase, right, what we call this process of engagement of the pioneer generation as part of the 50th anniversary of Singapore. So this was not just something that was a one-off thing. We started it at the 50th year, but it was meant to be something that was ongoing and in a sense, a set of new policies that were going to be out there. But why does all that happen? It happens because at this level of strategy, right, at the level of looking at trends and scenarios, we were thinking about how we could harness what people are nowadays calling the silver tsunami, right? Not just looking at an aging population as a source of challenge or a source of problems, but really saying how are they going to be an opportunity for a country like Singapore? Right? How do we harness the different positive effects and the benefits and the advantages that actually exist in an aging population? So you see this cartoon here, the silver tsunami can be quite scary if you don't know how to harness them as well and as effectively as possible. Right? So at all three levels, right, operations and planning and strategy, you find that there are different interlocking areas and interlocking sets of policy priorities, all of which need to be coherent. This is a slightly less positive example, but I think an equally instructive one. And this is more about crisis management rather than pure logistics. A few years ago, we experienced our first riots in a very long time. Right? Riots in Little India, sparked off by some skirmishes between foreign construction workers and in a particularly sensitive area. Right? Little India being an area where a lot of Bangladeshi workers and folks from South Asia often end up congregating. So the police were, of course, very deeply involved in managing the immediate effects of the riot. And it was a pretty significant thing. I mean, there was no widespread violence, but we did have a bus that got overturned and fires that got set off. And for a while, there was a fair amount of fear in thinking, all right, how do we deal with potential ramifications and consequences of this? But that was not just an event that existed at the crisis management level. At the level of planning, in terms of optimization, we had to ask ourselves, what do we do about our foreign worker policy? Who do we let in? How many do we let in from different countries? How long should they stay? All those are details that are part of the policy formulation process. But it wasn't just about foreign workers, right? We had to ask ourselves questions about our multiculturalism as well. We've always said that we are a multiracial society situated at the heart of Southeast Asia. And that means recognizing that diversity can be an asset for us. So how do we manage that aspect of multiculturalism? And these feed into the long-term strategy issues, right, around trends and scenarios. How do we diversify sources of foreign workers? Where else can we go to? Do we need them at all? Can we find ways to be self-sufficient in our construction needs? And how do we deal with hyphenated identities? People who live in Singapore who might be part Bangladeshi but part something else, right? Hyphenated in the sense that Jan mentioned I am, right? I have 3 or at least 4 hyphens in my name. I have no idea what I am at various points. My brothers and I have decided that we're pretty much mongrels, right? Mongrels of the world. But that's not a bad thing because that hyphenation lends itself to being, I think, very comfortable in a multicultural setting like Singapore. And I mention that because, again, in the case of the Little India riots, what we're seeing is multiple time frames all at work at the same time. And even as the police were managing the immediate security operations, we had to be thinking, what do we do about the planning process and what do we do about long-term strategy in order to optimize these various levels. Now, these are important because I think they illustrate the fact that there isn't a single process of public policy at work. We may think that there is, right? We may look at governments and assume, they all think the same way. But to be quite honest, those of us who do operations work versus those who do planning and those who do strategy, very often will have some levels of disagreement because the lens through which we view time is fundamentally quite different. The people who do operations will look at the strategy guys and think, oh, you have such luxury. You get to sit there and think long, big thoughts about the world. And you don't have to deal with deep stresses of every day having to get things right and every day having to make sure that you respond to very tight pressurizing deadlines. And then sometimes the strategy guys will look at those who do planning and operations and think, your stuff is so much more real than my work, right? I sometimes don't feel like I have an impact on things because the impact of what we do in strategy is so far down the road, right? We have to defer a great deal of gratification because the immediate effects will never be here, right? Someone else will benefit from the ideas that we put forward, hopefully, and the problems that we manage to avert in a good strategy formulation process. And so there's at least 3 levels of time, but I think there's actually more than that when you think about it. And I wanted to explore a few other types of time because I asked myself, what exists in a more immediate sense than operations? And what exists in a more long-term sense than the world of strategy, right? Is it just those 3 things, or can we actually view time as this much larger spectrum and continuum? So here, just to respond to Brian, I think I'm quite deeply Aristotelian in this respect, right? I think Plato was wrong about essential forms of anything. What we need is a much more dynamic view of where time is and what it looks like. So let's explore what some of these might actually be, right? Those of us who do communications work, who deal with the press and responding to social media, that's in a lot of ways even more immediate than the world of operations. Because you're dealing with press releases. If that's supposed to go out at 2 o'clock, it can't go out at 2:01 because stuff is going to go live at that point. You need to make sure that there is a timeliness to that work. Facebook and Instagram posts and tweets, those have created a deeply truncated time process for the public policy practitioner. And sometimes we don't have the luxury of sitting there thinking, oh, well, what about my long-term strategy in this particular instance? We have to respond if a Facebook post is out there. We have to deal with a tweet fairly immediately. Not always, but sometimes that response has to take place in a very compressed time frame. And this is in a lot of ways very familiar to many parts of the world, right? We live in a world where we're often told to just do it, right? Don't bother thinking too much. Just do stuff. Move fast. Break things. Why? Because you only live once. That's the kind of short, compressed time frames that we're dealing with. And there's actually a Formula One story about this, which I wanted to share with you. Not so much a race story, but a story that illustrates the compressed time frames nonetheless. I was on a recce trip with my minister, looking at the track 1 week before the Formula One race. And we'd done 3 hours of walking around the whole area. He seemed quite happy with the preparation of the logistics. And so he went off in his car, and the rest of us were about to go home. It was about 9 p.m. maybe. And we wanted to just go home and have a shower because we walked around for quite a while. And then I get this note saying, oh, Aaron, I get this text message basically from my minister saying, one of my constituents wants to take his wedding photographs at the Formula One track. So my immediate reaction is, why would anybody want to do that, right? But okay, someone did, for whatever reason. And they wrote on my minister's Facebook, they said, dear minister, the security guys won't let us in, life is so difficult, we feel very maligned and hard done by, we voted for you, can you please make sure that we can take these photographs? Again, my immediate reaction was to think, okay, I kind of understand this, but what do I need to do now, right? And so I get this note saying, can you please follow up? And of course, please follow up means, please make the problem go away, right? So that this person no longer writes on my Facebook and get them what they need. So there was no time to do any kind of strategy or planning there, right? That was the world of deep, immediate reaction. I called the police up, I called the Singapore Tourism Board. They then say, oh yeah, we got the same message. He clearly sent the text message to a whole bunch of different people. And we said, okay, well, let's coordinate. Let's make sure that something can happen here. And then, of course, someone has to call this person, right, who very kindly left their cell phone number on Facebook as well. At least that was helpful. But that's the world of immediate response, right, where there isn't time to sit there and think, oh, what should I do? What kind of precedent am I setting? If I let one person take photographs there, does that mean that 25 other people are going to want to take photographs tomorrow? These are all the thoughts that will go through some bureaucrat's minds. But in this case, we figured, well, let's just solve the problem, right? And it's not egregious what they wanted to do. They wanted to take photos for about 20 minutes, and they were clearly F1 fans as well. If it meant that much to them, and it was a minor inconvenience to us, then it felt right that we should actually do what we could to support them. So that's the world of communications, right? This is a world of fast, immediate, just do it responses. And I think that's even more quick than the world of ops. But there are many other types of worlds. And governments and companies are thinking about these all the time. I thought it was useful to explore some of these. One of those is product time. How long does it take a product to diffuse through a system? Everett Rogers, the great sociologist of the 1960s, has come up with what, for me, I think is one of the most defining ways to think about innovations and new products. How do they move, right? We start with the early adopters and who take up an idea from innovators, then you have an early and late majority, and finally you have the laggards, right? The people who only change their cell phones when the spare parts of those cell phones are no longer available. Brian, I was wondering actually when you were talking about your new and innovative kinds of economics, there are laggards in the world of economics as well, right? People who believe that everything needs to be reducible to equations. And sometimes those laggards exist in 800-year-old institutions who don't want to change anything, ever. So this exists for products, it exists for ideas, it exists for the evolution of intellectual disciplines as well. And I think this is a different way of looking at time, right? This is looking at time as a process of diffusion and not just as the periods in which discrete actions can actually get taken. But there are other types of time. I often think that micro and macroeconomics actually work in different periods of time. And I know that not all complexity theorists will believe that we should split the field of economics into micro and macro, which I generally agree with that. I think that there is a great porosity between the disciplines. But for what it's worth, I think in the world of microeconomics, we're dealing with the times in which it takes for incentives to actually translate and percolate through a system. In the world of macroeconomics, we're dealing with periods of either more compressed or more elongated business cycles. And those are very different sets of time frames. So when we talk about having micro foundations for macroeconomics, I think that's a very good idea in terms of theorizing. But we need to also accept that we may be dealing with parallel movements of time, and that both of those may not be entirely coincident or congruent with each other. Then there's this issue of play as well. Right? Not something we think about a lot in the world of public policy. But play is actually so critical, because if we truly want to innovate and explore and experiment, that means we have to fail. And we have to allow ourselves the freedom to work within a time of playing. Right? Lego is very good at the idea of serious play, but they're only building on an idea that came from many thinkers before them. Johan Huizinga, the very interesting Dutch thinker, talks about homo ludens. Right? We're not just homo sapiens, the thinking creature. We are homo ludens, the playing creature. And that it is play for him that actually defines so much of what we do. He identifies 5 aspects of play that are actually quite important. Play must be free, first of all. Second, it must be different from ordinary and real life. It must be distinct from real life in terms of both locality and duration. Third, it must create order of its own. Fourth, play must be connected to no material interest, right? So there has to be something apart from the financial or the pecuniary that's at work in play. And finally, from play, no profit should be able to be gained. That's an interesting world, isn't it? Because I'm going to read a quote here from Huizinga. He tells us that civilization in its earliest phases played. It does not come from play as a baby detaches itself from the womb, but civilization arises in and as play and never leaves it. So the time that we allow ourselves to play in is actually quite critical for us, because it is a time of freedom, and it doesn't have to be either long or short, right? The whole thing that defines playtime is not length or duration. It's not about the number of metronomical beats that you have to go through, but it's the amount of time that you have to actually explore something new and make some mistakes, and then be in that space for a while. So this is a very different kind of time when you think about it, and it's the kind of time when I say to public policy makers, we need to play a bit more, they often look at me like I'm on some strange sort of substance. What are you talking about? Of course we don't have time to play. We have serious work to do. But serious work sometimes involves serious play, not just being overly serious and formalized about the whole process. And I think Huizinga was onto something very powerful when he noticed the idea of homo ludens. And then we have the notion of cultural or attitudinal time, the times in which ideas can actually spread. This is a map from Eric Berlow and Sean Gurley's TED Talk, where they actually mapped all the ideas in every TED Talk that had ever been given up to that stage. and mapped the different themes that were there and how they kind of morphed into each other. Because in this world, what we're dealing with is, again, it's diffusion of an idea, right? And that may take a very long time in pure metronomical units. But in the world of ideas, the length isn't going to be particularly key. What matters is where the ideas go, how they do that diffusion, and how they meet and mix and meld and merge with one another. That's a very different kind of measurement, right, of the value of time compared to some of the more standard units of measurement that we might be much more familiar with. I think this is an interesting one because public policy makers, again, we don't always think about culture and attitude, but a lot of what we want to do is based on societal attitudes. Singapore needs people to have more babies. That is not going to happen through incentives. We've tried that, it hasn't really worked. What we need to do is shift attitudes. We need to shift the sense of culture and the deep values that we hold. That's about working within the space of cultural and attitudinal time, not the world of incentives or simply looking at cause and effect in a basic sort of way. So this becomes quite critical for us as well. And then there's this idea of civilizational time. If you're a gamer, you will understand that civilizations can rise and fall within 5 or 10 minutes. Right? In real life, of course, civilizations rise and fall in much longer time frames than that. But when you take a civilizational view, sometimes that can open up new opportunities. It's often said of the Chinese leadership, for instance, that they are not thinking about the world in very, in necessarily economic or geopolitical terms. They are thinking in civilizational terms. If you look at the folks in India, there's a bit of that there as well. Because these are people whose civilizations have existed forever, right? Since the days of Mohenjo-Daro and Shi Huangti, and maybe even before that. They don't think of the world in terms of, electoral cycles. What does it matter if one leader changes and another one doesn't change at some point? When you think in civilizational terms, what you're looking at is a much deeper sense of longevity. Right? And if you're looking at civilizational survival or civilizational evolution, then the aims of a foreign policy establishment will be very different. Now, I don't know if Singapore has a sense of a Singaporean civilization. I think that might be the height of arrogance for us to ponder, right? But it's important for us to also think not just about the immediate short-term perturbations that exist in a system, but we have to also ask ourselves, will we be around in 100 years? Can there be something like a Singaporean civilization, even if it's not something that's recognized the world over? And if we think about ourselves in civilizational terms, how does that change the nature of the choices and the decisions that we actually have to make? So I think this is actually a very profound idea when we consider that civilizational time actually frees us up to consider new possibilities, new ideas and new angles and lenses through which to view issues that may not have been available to us if we looked at everything purely through the aim of short-term optimization. And then there's ecological and biological time as well. This poster is from Yellowstone. And some of you will know the story of how at one point wolves were removed from the Yellowstone ecology. And what that caused to happen was that then meant that the animals which the wolves ate, the elk, started to multiply greatly. And that had long-term cascading effects on pretty much every other aspect of the ecology. It affected all the other animals, it affected the trees, and when you affect trees, you affect river flows because you're also affecting how compactly the soil is held together. And when you reintroduce the wolves, which they did at one point, in ecological time, vast transformations took place over the entire landscape. Because again, the animal populations rebalanced, the plant populations changed, and that meant that the rivers actually ended up flowing differently. So again, there's a very different sense of time here, right? That time none of these transformations would have happened if we had wanted everything to take place in a 5 or 1 or 2 year time frame, right? The ecology needed time to transform itself. And I wonder about this as well, because when we're dealing with humans, we live in an ecology as well. I mean, almost every speaker has said the word ecology so far. Right? So there's a certain bent there, I think, in how we're all viewing the idea of time. But we need to think about ecologies because some of the transformations that we live through are transformations that will require ecological time, not just the simplistic transformations of a matrix quickly, but transformations that need much more space to actually live and breathe before their effects can fully be felt. So I wanted to talk a bit about evolutionary time as well, and now that this is I guess a corollary to the diagram you had up yesterday, right? Yours was the positive evolutionary diagram. Mine is a slightly more, not quite dismal, but a slightly more pessimistic look, I guess, in terms of how man is actually evolving. We kind of look more ape-like today than we did at any point in our previous evolutionary stages. But I mention this because, again, we evolve on a very different set of time frames, right? And I think you've heard this earlier on from Doug as well. These evolutions do not happen in time frames that are easily metricized. They're not easy for us to sit down and calibrate and quantify in ways that are immediately amenable to calculation. Evolutionary time takes place over a much longer span. In some ways longer than, in some ways shorter than ecological time, right? Because there are many deep natural transformations that are taking place. And I thought this was an important one to mention as well, because there may be some things in a public policy world where we can't affect evolution in any of the immediate generation or even 2 or 3 generations after. We may need to accept that some transformations will just take a much longer time than any of us has at our disposal. And that, I think, again, changes the mindset of the policymaker in terms of what becomes possible and what you bang your head against the wall about versus what you need to be a bit more zen about and say, well, the world is simply as it is, I need to adjust to it. And I wanted to talk about recovery time as well, because I think this is something we often forget about. How many of us have taken medication for an illness and then ended up starting to run too fast or going back to work too early and then ending up with a relapse of that illness that was far worse than the initial bout that we might have had? I see some knowing nods here and there. Other people are avoiding eye contact at this stage. Yeah, so you can tell, right? We've all done something like this before. And I mention this because, again, recovery works in very strange, not always visible ways. Right? And whether we're dealing with something like illness or addiction or grief, right? The process of dealing with the loss of a loved one, all of that takes time. And I think good public policy makers recognize that that process needs to take place. Because sometimes people need to grieve. I'm not just talking about when people die necessarily, right? But when we take things away from people. When a policy causes a change, right? When we say things like, we're going to demolish part of our national library, which we've done before, in order to make way for a new road. When we say things like, schools are going to merge, right? Or we close down an old school for the very efficient, practical reason that they don't have enough students anymore. There might be good reasons to do it, but do we give people enough time to recover and to grieve over that process? Do we help them? And do we help them to navigate that type of unit of time? Right? Which is a very different unit of time from the very practical-minded person saying, well, we've got to put a press release out tomorrow, we have to tell this story, and then let's just move on with the next public policy project that we have. I think if we are more time literate, actually we will find ways to help that and nudge that recovery process as well. And not always assume that it will take care of itself, because it won't. Right? And those of us who assume that recovery will happen by some kind of automatic wave of a magic wand have often ended up mistaken. And then we realize too late that actually maybe we needed to just give it a bit more time, and we would have had much more lasting, much more sustainable results. This is a great example of one instance where populations have found ways to slow themselves down, right, and not always assume that a faster unit of time is necessarily better. In response to the coming of McDonald's to Italy, particularly in Rome, right, which is so full of history and traditions, some Italians actually set up what they called slow food instead of fast food, right? And slow food wasn't just food that was made slowly. It was also food that was not mass-produced. It encouraged local produce consumption. It got their supplies from much more localized groups of farmers, and it encouraged the employment of locals, right? Using techniques that were much more localized and indigenous to Italy rather than adopting the franchise model that McDonald's had. Because franchises and international processes like McDonaldization of things exist in one time frame, right? The time frame of efficiency. But in this case, what they were trying to do, I think, was to realize, well, maybe we want to slow ourselves down a bit. Maybe we don't need everything to be as fast. And so they eventually, from just slow food, they actually set up something called Cita Slow, which is slow cities. Right? And there are now slow cities all over Europe, not just in Italy anymore. And I think the Norwegian philosopher that I've quoted here gets the idea of what a slow city actually is. Right? Because he tells us that in a world where everything changes, what we end up inadvertently having is that the rate of change increases. And if we want to hang on, we have to speed up. Right? This is the world of YOLO, and you only live once, and how you have to move fast and break things. But what does it say in that whole bit there? He says, we also have a need for nearness and care and for a little love. And this is given only through slowness in human relations. In order to master changes, we have to recover slowness, reflection, and togetherness. There we will find real renewal. Right? So this is dealing with time in a much different way, right, from a method that looks purely at the worlds of efficiency and the lenses of quickness. Right? We're dealing here with time that is actually deliberately slowing itself down, right, and realizing, I think, that there are multiple time frames that we can actually operate in, and then chooses the one that it wants to be part of. So why did I share all of this with you? Because what we realize, I think, when we actually examine time, and here I want to push the point that I think all the earlier speakers have been alluding to already, we're really dealing with a highly multifarious phenomenon. There is no single time that we can pin down, right? There's only times in the plural that we need to deal with. And depending on how we both perceive and experience those levels of time, we find that the experience actually changes. The wonderful writer Eviatar Zerubbabel talks a bit about this in his book. And what I've given you here, right, is the sections of chapter 1 in his book, Collective Memory and the Social Shape of the Past. And I like them because they're wonderfully intuitive labels when you look at them. Right? He says that we look at time through things like plot lines and narratives. Right? So, okay, I think this is your point from yesterday as well. Right? That narrative shapes how we perceive time. And what are examples of plot lines? Well, things like progress and decline. Right? We make sense of the past by assigning these ideas and by assigning these labels to particular ways of viewing the world. But he says even progress and decline are not everything. Sometimes time moves in a zigzag. Progress and decline are very continuous functions, right? They move in the same direction each way. But maybe time moves in a zigzag. It goes up and then it goes down, and up and down over and over again. Maybe we're dealing with ladders and trees, right? Ladders being situations where you keep going up in the same sort of direction. So you move from the Iron Age to the Bronze Age, or you move from the Jurassic to the Triassic, or the other way around, right? And then to the Cretaceous period. There's a certain ladder-like quality to that movement. But even that isn't enough, because sometimes when we move from one rung of a ladder to another, we leave the old one behind. But time doesn't work like that, because as we move to a new thing, there are vestiges and remains of the old that continue to exist with us. And that's the idea of the tree, right? So as some types of monkeys evolve to become other types of monkeys and eventually become humans, the older monkeys are still around, right? That's them moving in an evolutionary tree from one branch to another, but the old stuff is still there. And then he talks about circles and rhymes, because maybe life moves in circles, right? Time doesn't always move in a straight line. Time might move in endless circles that each enclose one aspect of another, right? A day is enclosed within a week, which is enclosed within a month, which is enclosed within a year, which is enclosed within a decade. Those are your overlapping circles of time. And rhymes are such that even when we move in cycles, we recognize some things about the past, but not everything. That, I think, is what prompted Mark Twain to say that history doesn't always repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Right? That's the idea there, that we're capturing. That there are some similarities, but not total similarities. It's not the same word, but the sound is enough to remind you of the echo of what happened before. And then he says that, well, sometimes we need to look at the world in mountains and valleys as well. We remember the mountains, right? The momentous things that happened in the past. My college at Oxford is very funny. They keep changing the codes of the doors, for us to get into different parts of the college, like the laundry room and areas to collect our mail. And I can tell you this now because the passwords have now changed. But this last term, they decided that the internal codes were going to be 1919, 1939, 1989. And of course, some people looked at it and the mathematicians all said, oh, those are interesting numbers, they all end in 9, right? And then the historians and the social scientists looked at it and said, those are such significant years for the 21st century, right? 1919, 1939, 1989. Those are mountains in this past, in the past century that we've had. But the valleys are the things that we don't remember at all. The bits that we somehow consigned to history and said, well, nothing much happened there. And yet, we all know that stuff must have happened there, right? Because otherwise the momentous things would not have taken place. So we impose where the mountains and the valleys are. But is that always accurate? Because maybe the valleys are deep in ways that also need to be examined. Not just by having us look at the mountains and the heights that they necessarily reach. I think this is important because it affects what we decide to put in history textbooks, right? Think about the history textbooks that some of you will have studied when you were in school. I don't know about you, but I remember there being a great deal of many mountains up till 1965 when Singapore became independent. And then suddenly we switched from chronological history to thematic history. After that we studied industrialization, something that happened in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And we didn't look at much political history anymore. Interesting, right? Where the mountains and the valleys actually were. And finally, this issue of legato and staccato. Legato time is time that is smoothly flowing, right? These are musical terms, right? Legato music flows from one note to another in a very, very fluid sort of way. Staccato music is starter-rated and sharp. Now, which is our view of time? Do we think of time as a legato movement from one thing to another? Or do we think about it in a much more staccato way? I think all the different types of time lend themselves to different interpretations. And what I like about the Zerubbabel work is that it helps us to see that there are many lenses through which time can be viewed, and that once we see them, we suddenly realize, well, there's actually a lot of different ways we can look at things. And that, I think, helps us to widen the lenses and the prisms through which we actually look at the world. But I wanted to share this as well, because everything we've looked at so far still assumes a certain amount of chronology, whether it's legato or staccato. Right? It assumes that time t plus 1 always comes after time t, and that there is a certain constant progression from that. I wanted to share this slide because when we look at the world of ideas, maybe there are other ways to think about it. Right? The great work of Popper and Thomas Kuhn and Imre Lakatos, all of those talk about how ideas improve or change in a fairly continuous and progressive way. Popper says that we have to falsify old ideas, and that creates new thought. Kuhn tells us that there are paradigm shifts, right, from old to new, and we replace old ideas that way. Lakatos says, well, Kuhn wasn't quite right, because we don't know when the paradigm shifts are going to happen, so maybe what ends up actually really happening is what he called progressive research programs, right? The constant small iterations that eventually produce new ideas, but never with the big bang of a paradigm shift. Now, they're all very different thinkers, but each of them assumes a certain progressiveness in time, because new ideas will, by some reasoning process, whether it's falsification or paradigm replacement or progressiveness, replace the old. Now, contrast that with this idea from Jewish law, right? From the idea of pilpul, which hails from Jewish Talmudic exegesis, right? So scriptural study, basically. This says that, well, there is a question and answer method of dialogue within the scripture in which then an answer might appear in ancient Babylonia to an ethical question formulated later and elsewhere in the Spain of the Moors or the Sephardic Jews or the people of today. Now what this is interesting, right? It's time moving, it's ideas moving across time. And suddenly we realize, oh, actually today we can find answers in 500 years ago, and this is not quite time travel, right? But it's allowing us to basically realize that we don't need to deal with time as a continuous function. We can deal with it in ways that allow us to jump across many different experiences of time. Just as we, when we come up with thought experiments and ask ourselves, in 2050, if X happened, what would we do? We are also dealing with some element of ilpo, right? Because we're looking at what the insights of the future can give us into the ways in which we operate today. So I think this is about time moving across time. Even Zerubbabel doesn't write about this. Right? This is an idea that comes from, I think, a much older source, but is nonetheless very illuminative for the ways in which we look at the problem of time. All of which leads me to ask ourselves, well, okay, if there are these multiple and potentially infinite series of times, including time where we move across different eras fairly fluidly, as the Jewish rabbis have us do, then what can we do about it? I think this is key. Because if we don't answer this question, then everything remains a very interesting academic process, but it doesn't change the ways in which we did. So what do we do? For me, I think one key is to ask ourselves what our metaphor for time actually is. What are we treating it as? Is it a point that is instantaneous, transient, and fleeting, as well as fleeing? Is it a line that is mechanistic and deterministic and moves in a single direction? Is it a stock, to use the economic phrase, or the economic concept? Is it something that's malleable, but still finite and fairly unchanging? Or is it a flow? Something that is dynamic, living, and open to human action. And here again, I think we go back to the Plato-Aristotle debate, right? I think time is a flow. And that we're dealing with something that is sometimes chronological, right? The Greek notion of chronos, or sequential time that has clear units. But sometimes time can also be kairos, time that is timeless, right? Transcendental time, which we are not always able to access, but which some actions can lead us to. So I'm getting to the last few slides here, which kind of build on all the earlier material to take us to some policy conclusions. Because the place I want to start with that, right, is here. This is a picture of a monastery. Yet another echo from yesterday. Right? The Japanese monasteries yesterday. Today we're looking at a monastery from the west coast of the US. Right? This is a place called New Camaldoli, which is a community of 18 Benedictine monks. There used to be a slightly more than that, but 2 died in the last 2 years, unfortunately. And they haven't been recruiting very well. But they live there, and they, I think, are an interesting example of what modern monasticism looks like. And they live life in extremely ordered temporal flows. First of all, like any Catholic institution, they will follow the rhythms of the liturgical year, right? They move from ordinary time to periods like Lent, which is where we are now, and then Easter, and then there's Advent and Christmastide, and then ordinary time again. But in a week, they also live by a certain temporal flow, because there are readings that start on Sunday night that lead up to Mass the following Sunday. And then in a day, they follow what is called the Liturgy of the Hours. And the reason I mention them is I go visit this monastery once a year, partly because when you've done Formula 1, you need to slow down and do something like this. And this became very necessary for me as a space to decompress and literally to find another way of looking at time after the frantic running around of public policy work. And what I like about these guys is they're in that flow, right? In that looking at time in such, not rigid, but very clear regularities. I think they found a way to actually manage that line between kairos and chronos. And here again, Zerubbabel has some insights for us. Because he actually wrote an article in 1981 called The Benedictine Ethic and the Modern Spirit of Scheduling, right? To tell us that modern monasteries actually were some of the first places that came up with the idea of a schedule. The bell rings, you know you go and have lunch. The bell rings again, and you know you're ready for post-lunch prayer. Then you go off and work. Then the bell rings again, and you come back for Vesper, which is the evening prayer. And then you go have dinner. And then after that, the bell rings again, and you come back for Complet, the evening prayer. And then you go and sleep. Why? Because monks wake up very early, so they sleep very early as well. Right? And in all of this, he says there is what he calls rhythmicity, right? A rhythm at work there that comes from the ordering of time. But not ordering in strict units necessarily, right? It's just an ordering that allows some element of structure. What is it that they're structuring? They're structuring the location of events and activities, right? In temporal terms. They're also standardizing the rates of recurrence. So how fast or how slowly something takes place more than once is standardized in the rule of St. Benedict. And then there's standardization across the year, the week, and the day, as I mentioned earlier. And what he finds is that this allows them to differentiate and individuate themselves at the same time, right? So to talk about trying to be in two places at the same time, as we had a bit of a discussion on that yesterday, right? How do we manage that contradiction of trying to do two things and perceive two things at the same time? He finds that this looking at regularization helps them to do it. They both differentiate themselves from the rest of society, and within the times that they have, each individual leads a flourishing life. He finds that this also gives them what he calls mechanical and organic solidarity. Mechanical because the monks do the same things at the same time in community, right? So there's a mechanical structure to it. But within that, they form relationships, they form individual connections that leads to a much more organic solidarity. And I think this tells us, it starts to hint at the fact that we can be intentional about how we manage our time. Many years later, Zerubbabel wrote a book called The Clockwork Muse, which as an aspiring PhD student, I have great sympathy for, because it's all about writing books and writing theses. Right? So how do you go about actually doing the writing? And what I love about that book is Zerubbabel taking inspiration from the deep deliberateness of the Benedictine scheduling. He tells us that we all live in A, B, and C time. A time is the time we should spend doing our best work. Right? For some of us, that's the morning. For some of us, that might be the afternoon instead of taking a nap. For some of us, it might be the evening. But A time is us at our absolute best. B time is kind of us, okay, functional, but not great. And C time is us at our worst, right? It's us tired and depleted by the day. And what he tells us, it's a wonderful little book. For those who haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. What he tells us is, don't waste A time doing C activity. How many times have we all had that happen, right? We know we're supposed to draft something. We're supposed to get the slides ready for a conference like this. And what do? We clear our desks. Right? Yes, again, small bits of recognition here and there. You know, or we vacuum the floor, right? Or we clean the kitchen. That is wasting A time on C-grade activity. A time, if it's meant to be for writing, should be for writing. If it's meant to be for practicing dance, it should be for practicing dance. If it's to draft poetry, then it should be for drafting poetry. B time is when you do things that support your A activity. So in the case of a PhD student, that's when you download all the articles that you want to read during your A time. Right? For the rest of you, it might be about reading other things that inspire the work that you want to do. And then C time is when you're tired, then you reply to emails, right? Or check your WhatsApp and put little comments on Facebook, or just keep scrolling and liking things over and over again. Right? But when we mix that up, right, when we schedule things badly, that I think is when we end up wasting the A time or squandering it because we've done C activity in it. So across all of this, my basic point, I think, or rather my realization, is that actually we can work with time much more than we think we can. The same way the great Western monasteries have done, the same way I think any monasteries do, right, by regularizing things. Because when necessary, we can speed up time. We can move into the compression of race time and operational time through routines and other organizational life. We do this through diary reminders, right? Through setting deadlines for ourselves that go off with a ping on our phone or our computers. We do it through what I think of as the great values of nagging and nudging, right? If you're an organizational leader, sometimes you want to elongate time for your team, and other times you want to breathe down their necks and say, where is the thing that you're supposed to give to me? Nagging and nudging, right, become quite key in the animation of the organizational life. And I want to be careful here, right? Because I'm not saying we nag and nudge just as a matter of recourse. We don't do it all the time. But when done intentionally, when done in a way that helps us to structure and massage the time that we work in, it can actually be very powerful. And technology can help us with this. This is where we set up WhatsApp groups, right, and Slack channels. Some friends and I are on a new app called Discord, which was originally a gamer's app, but we're now using it as a way of communicating across the miles on a project that we all want to coordinate for. And it's great because you can use the app to make calls, you can use the app to do private messages, you can use the app for group conversations. And that helps us to compress time and create an immediacy around the project that we're doing jointly. But sometimes we also need to slow down the routines. And we need to do that intentionally as well. And again here, what we are doing is deliberately managing the rhythmicity of our lives. Right? We do this through retreats and offsites or white space. As an individual, we might do it through meditation and yoga. So leaders will sometimes need to create what we call reaction space. And here I want to tell this wonderful story about walking slowly. Some years ago, we had a visitor to the Civil Service College called Jocelyn Bourbon. Jocelyn used to be the equivalent of the head of civil service in Canada, right? The secretary to the Privy Council. She's a wonderfully zen woman. She's like, a public policy equivalent of Yoda. She doesn't look like Yoda, but she is like Yoda in many ways, right? Because some of us asked her, we said, how do you manage in a crisis? Right? Because clearly she had seen many crises, both political and policy related. And her answer was these two words: walk slow. Why is that profound? Because we might think, oh, we only have a certain number of hours and minutes available, right? She said, yeah, that's true, but nobody's going to die if you take 2 minutes rather than 1 minute to walk to another room. So walk slower. Give yourself the time to breathe and to think. Why is it we're sometimes told to take 5 deep breaths before doing anything new or before anything stressful? Not just because it calms us down, but because it buys us time. It gives us a space to react in a much more thoughtful way, and it gives us a way, I think, to regulate the rhythms of the space that we happen to be in. And in all of that, I think it's key to remember that we have agency in this. Time is not just an external thing forced upon us. It is a flow that we live in and that we can manage. And the more we feel that we can do that, right, with agency and deliberate intention, then I think the better the policy outcomes will be, but also the better the individual outcomes will be. Because actually time is something that all of us have agency to manage. So I'll stop there and let's see if we have any questions or thoughts.
This works.
Yes.
Thank you, Aaron. This was fantastic.
Great one.
Questions. We have a whole half hour for questions and discussions. And
I'll go for one.
so, who will start? Helga.
Thank you. A wonderful talk. I think I share this with everyone in the audience. And since I've worked on time for a long time, I really appreciate it. I would like to get more reflections of you on institutions as time givers. Because working with government, you are involved in an institutional organizational framework, and institutions, organizations are time givers or time setters in many ways, because it's a collective way of organizing our life.
Yep.
Now, these time givers sometimes lead to clashes and time conflicts. And some of the pressure we feel comes from being caught between the different temporal demands that we are experiencing that come from these time givers. In academic life, you have certain dates, deadlines, students have to complete their work at a certain time, or they should reach a certain level of having finished their exams, etc. This very often clashes with other temporal demands, be it from family, be it from what they want to do, etc. Yeah. And many people start to think about time through the conflicts they experience. And something that institutions as time givers often do not allow us, and this is one suggestion to your wonderful list of, the many time frames that I would like to add to you, maturation time. Because I think we have too little awareness. Ideas need to mature, persons need to mature, and also institutions sometimes, and even governmental leaders need time for maturation. So I would like to, I would very much appreciate your replies.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. I agree with everything you've said. And maybe just a couple of thoughts in response. First of all, on maturation, right? I agree it takes time, and we can also help that process along, right? Through things like feedback and critique that help us to actually grow. And institutions can offer that sometimes. But I think if they don't offer it, because not all institutions are going to structure things such that there are organized ways for feedback to be given. Personally, as a leader, I found it's very useful to ask for feedback, right? And create a space whereby it's as safe as possible for people to provide it. Sometimes just leaving a Google Doc open and saying, tell me everything you want me to keep doing, tell me what you want me to stop doing, and then I can actually reflect on it after that. But even giving feedback is sometimes very useful because it helps in the maturation process, I think. Sometimes there are things we may not know we need to mature in, right? And I think if we can structure some of that a little bit better, and again, be intentional about it, I think that is very helpful. I think a lot of the conflicts that you described are partly about organizational priorities, but they also boil down in a lot of ways to personalities, right? A senior leader who is the kind who likes to wait until the very end before making a decision is going to give you a very different kind of time stock or time flow compared to the one who, the minute you send them something, they agree to it or they disagree, and then you know for sure what you need to do in response. And I think feedback is sometimes useful to try and change that behavior, but it's also harder to change behavior in certain instances, I think. And also, I feel like we often may not realize the full range of pressures that the very senior people are subject to, right, in an institution. So how have my teams and I dealt with some of this? Right? We try to understand the personalities that we are working with, right? And then give them the support that they need to function and be their best. So I'll give you some examples of this. We've had some bosses who are the kind who, they will reply to their emails within the day, and they'll give you a clear-cut decision, yes or no, or they'll tell you what they need to have worked on a little bit more. And those types of bosses are fantastic, right, in terms of being a bureaucrat, because you know exactly what you need to do in response, and then you go away and get it done. But we had other bosses, who shall remain unnamed, or undescribed in any further way, who would not always do that. And so if they needed a paper done by, say, Thursday, because Thursday afternoon they were going to meet the Prime Minister or had to attend an important meeting, they would probably let you know their comments on Wednesday night, right? Or they would look at it on Monday and give you some comments, and Tuesday they give you more comments, and Wednesday they give you an even greater series of comments. And I remember saying to the team, I said, look, we can bang our heads against the wall about this, right? We can treat this as conflict, or we can say that we have agency in how we respond. And so we said, all right, if we know that this person needs a lot of time, then let's give it to them, right? Let's make sure that we finish the thing a week in advance, give it to them, let them mull on it for as long as they need, and then we knew that the night before and the morning of that meeting, we would deliberately empty the schedule. We would create the space for ourselves to do the responses. I mean, of course, if other things happen to come up, then you have a team and you try and respond by deploying different people to different tasks. But where possible, we would say, all right, empty that time. And if I knew that I was tabling an important paper at a meeting on Thursday afternoon, my Thursday morning was utterly clear. And two things would happen. One is the time would need to be used, in which case I would be grateful that I had set it aside. Or, if by some miracle the thing got cleared the night before, then I would just enjoy the fact that I had some free time that morning, right? And get caught up with other things that were going to be demands on my time. But I think it's what game theorists would call a dominant strategy, right, in that case, to actually get the stuff done before. So I think once we understand the personalities at work and the things that drive the different sets of priorities, we can, I think, try to be intentional about it and how we respond. Yeah.
Lady over there.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to speak to you as a Singaporean.
Oh, okay.
So
that's usually a dangerous sign, actually, yeah. But go for it, yeah.
So you're really a great public policy person. So I want to ask you about a little bit of what Helga was saying yesterday, which is really the values that a society or a government chooses. And I'd like for you to tie all that you've done, which is actually very rich and very complete, back to public policy a little tighter. and say, and use Singapore as an example of given all that you've said, theoretical and otherwise, and great advice, some agreeable, some very disagreeable, what does that mean for public policy as practice in Singapore today? And what is wrong? For example, I mean, the one thing that you alluded to, but you didn't make it one chart, which is really Singapore is very much about election time. You know, the things, as it ties back to public policy, as a citizen, we're not blind to the fact that many of the policies are about votes. So I think when you tie all of that back, it's that mindset that I want you to comment on, because it's that worldview that a country like Singapore has, which is, for those of you who don't know, is very much about vulnerability. You know, from day one that Singapore was around, it's all about die, you're not going to make it. You're just not going to make it. And die, this is what you must do. In fact, this is die, this is what you must do is actually a very common phrase here. All right, so now that we're into the second part after SG50, Lee Kuan Yew has passed away. It worked in his time, and now we've got this new group coming up, supposedly. So all the things that you talked about in time and mindset and public policy. So where do you see us now in Singapore?
That's a very big question. Right? So did you want to add to it? Yeah, go for it, yeah. Yeah, if there are similar questions, let's take them and then we cluster them somewhat. Yeah.
I've spent some time recently.
Sorry, let's wait for the mic.
I've spent some time recently in the UK, and I'm beginning to understand how other governments work. I'm sure you have colleagues in other governments, and I just wanted to know, compared to other countries, when you talk to them, do they see Singapore as particularly reliant on election time, or do we have possibly a longer term view? I don't know, but I'd just like to know comparatively, what's your impression?
Right. Yes, and those two are related questions. Because my immediate response was going to be on this issue of votes, right? The fact that actually all countries have that. I think as long as you have a party-based system, there is going to be some amounts of time where elections are top of mind, right, or top of priorities for some of the key decision makers. And that doesn't make us very different from, say, the UK or Australia or New Zealand or the USA, although I think, thankfully, our outcomes have not been quite as disastrous as the US election system, at least. You know, and I think it's important to remember that one of the challenges there is that actually each of us is many things, right? Just as there are many time frames. We are voters. We are also receivers of government services. We're also citizens. We're also taxpayers. And each of those things actually involves slightly different sets of instincts, right? Because as a taxpayer, I'm a bit like a shareholder. I can say, I'm holding you accountable for the following things because I pay my taxes, right? But as a citizen, I can also say, I'm holding you accountable for some things, but there are things I also want in return because I have a set of rights and responsibilities and I belong in this place and the government is supposed to serve the citizens, right? As a receiver of government services, my instincts might be quite different. I might be inclined to say, I want things to work. I want them to be as effective and as efficient as possible. And that's going to be quite different from my notions as a voter, right? So I'm not saying that all those things pull us in very different directions, but each of them has a slightly different complexion on the kinds of thinking and thought processes that we go through. And I actually think that the deeper tension that's at work in what you're describing is the fact that in the early years for Singapore, that narrative of vulnerability, and in a sense the urgency of having to survive, made it such that there was real mission clarity about what we needed to do, right? From politicians to citizens and to taxpayers and everybody around, basically. We kind of knew what we needed to do in terms of hunkering down and making sure we survived. So there was an elegant simplicity about that narrative. And people often say, right, the great thinkers who look at narratives will often tell you that vulnerability narratives are fantastic for galvanizing people, but they don't often last. In most places, they last about 10 years and then they fizzle out. In Singapore's case, they lasted a lot more than 10 years. But I think it is also starting to fray at the edges, right? And nobody wants to just hear the fact that we are vulnerable anymore. We all want to hear about hope and ambition and belonging, right? And the possibilities that are out there. And I think one trick that we really need to have is to have a much more multi-layered narrative, right? One that says a few different things. So if I had to articulate the narrative, what I would say it has to have is, first of all, it needs to give people a sense of hope, right? A sense that there is something to work towards in the future. Second, we need to have a sense of belonging, right? Because you want to feel like this thing that is moving towards the future is something to which you have a connection. If you don't belong to it, then you might as well go live in Melbourne or Perth, right? Or move to the UK or something like that, right? So that deep sense of belonging is critical. The third thing, though, and this one I think is important, is a sense of what I like to call reality. Because yes, Singapore is not as vulnerable as it was in the 1960s, but we are still subject to certain constraints that many other parts of the world are not. And I'm not just talking geopolitics here, right? It's not just the fact that we have neighbors who are potentially difficult, although we have quite good relations with them at the moment. It's also the fact that we are a tiny space with very little room for maneuver in our land zoning and urban planning. We have to be both city and island and state at the same time. And we're deeply multicultural. Put all of those things together, and those are very difficult policy priorities to simultaneously be able to meet at any given point in time. Right? So I think a sense of that reality is important. Because yes, we may all want to have as many different policy priorities met as possible. But I can see a time, probably less than 10 years away, when we may have to look at a plot of land and ask ourselves, do we build a school there and invest in the future, or do we build a hospital there and invest in our graying, aging population? And those are both lofty, wonderful policy aims, but they are not both able to be met in the same physical space. So I think those constraints are very real, right? So hope, belonging, reality. And then the last thing that I think is important is a sense of action, right? We need people to understand that everybody has a level of agency and some influence over the future. Not total influence, and not so much that we should be arrogant about it, but we have some role to play. And if we don't all feel empowered to take that action, then I think our national narrative becomes very difficult. So I would say it has to have all four of those things. And that's a much more multi-textured, potentially contradictory set of narratives than the simple one that says, we have to survive. But part of maturation, to use Helga's word, is learning to deal with more and more of those contradictions, I think. And just as yesterday Samir said, we kind of have to learn how to deal with both the micro and the macro at the same time, right? We may not be able to see two worlds simultaneously, but over time, we can manage those multiple polarities and tensions. And I think if we allow ourselves the space to do that, that's when we can actually start to manage them in a much more effective way. Yeah. We've got a question there and one here as well.
Right.
Maybe let's take this one and then we'll come over there.
Give it back, please.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I'll say who speaks.
Okay, so just want to shift from maybe overall institutions to states to the professional world.
Yeah.
So first I wanted to thank you because I first had these comments a little over a year ago. I've used that in my own corporate world, going from communications, branding, data science, and now I've also been told to get a real job in operations.
Yeah.
And I wanted to try and embed that in praxis. You talked about how certain teams have a dominant style in a different layer of time, right? So some teams are dominated in race time and others are in planning time, as it were. I want to get a sense of understanding, what would that skill sets be required to time shift, as it were, right? To be conduits between these various times. Yeah. And maybe a question above that is it required for everyone to be such conduits, or should there be certain individuals that are conduits? Like, of course, best case for everyone to be in that state, but is that required? So, two-part question for that.
Yeah. No, that's a very interesting question, actually. Like, how do we create these, what I like to call time togglers, Not time travelers, but people who can toggle between the different times and the sets of instincts and priorities that you might actually need. I don't think you need everyone to do it. If I had to put a number, I would say maybe 15 to 20% of a system should have that ability to translate, because they will help to build empathy amongst different teams as much as can be done. And then the rest of the system actually benefits from having deep specialists in particular areas of time. Because there is something to be said, I think, about people who have only been working, say, in operations or done very deep strategy or very deep policy work, or in the terms of the races as well, right? You don't want the engineer kind of flitting to be a driver at some points and then at other times being a car designer as well. I think that ability to specialize is useful, but you need the people who are also seeing the big picture and how the different times intersect with each other and how they might interact as well. So that's the big picture question about how much of the deep specialization you need. Then your other question was about, in each of the times, what kind of skills do people need, right?
For the togglers.
Oh, you need it for the togglers. I see. Okay, so for the togglers, what actually would be necessary? It's an interesting question, because on one part, I would say that they actually need to have had deep experience in each thing, but maybe had about 80% of the full experience, even if they haven't gone as fully deep as others might have. They need to be relentlessly curious, because if they're not curious, they won't be interested in how the other types of time actually might operate, right? So that curiosity is key. I think a certain amount of empathy is also important, right? For understanding that the other guy might be really getting on your nerves at one point because they're coming from a different time perspective, but actually they have a very valid view of the work that they're trying to do. So empathy, I think, becomes critical. And then the last thing would actually be an idea that I like to call contradiction management or polarity management. And I mentioned it a little bit in response to the previous question, but let me expand a bit more on that, right? I think very often in policy work especially, we might be faced with having to make choices between two things that are almost as wrong as each other, or choosing between two rights, right? Or choosing between things that look really irreconcilable, right? So how can you be both kind and firm at the same time, right? How do you be efficient about your use of resources and human in the concerns that you have, that you're trying to put forward? And in this case, you might feel like that you're trying to have both race time and real time at the same time, right? Or you might be trying to make operations and strategy decisions together, and you would feel like they're pulling you in different directions. Again, I'll go back to, I think Samir's talk yesterday was actually quite instructive on this. How do we try and do two things at the same time? And what I thought he was getting at, although he didn't articulate it in quite the same way, was to say, well, maybe we don't do them at exactly the same instant, right? But we try and alternate between them as much as possible. For me, the great metaphor here is, well, there's two metaphors. It's breathing and walking. When we breathe, we either breathe in or we breathe out, right? We don't try and do both at the same time, do we? I think if you're a really gifted saxophone player, maybe you can do that. I can't, right? But we breathe in and then we breathe out, and we accept that the two need to be in dynamic tension with each other. Same thing with walking, right? We have the right legs function and the left legs function, and you could hop, I suppose, and use both. But most of us don't have to. And I think walking is therefore a process of managing the dynamic polarities between the two limbs. And I think in this case, I would say give yourself the time to make sure that you can immerse in both or all three aspects of ops, strategy, and planning, and make sure that you can therefore juggle the different polarities that are involved. That's what toggling is about, you see. Toggling is about being comfortable, fluidly moving from one thing to another, just as we toggle apps on our phones. And I think that's the kind of skill that you would actually need. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much for your lecture.
Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to bring you away from the real world. Reasons because I'm actually born in the web, and my day and night is spent in cyberspace.
Okay.
So because you are part of the policy maker, so I'd like to draw your attention to the cyberspace. Just tell me one person here don't live there for any moment in time during his or her day or night. Mm-hmm. So it is very critical that the vulnerability there is far greater than what you imagine. I deal with cyberspace security, a very vast domain. I don't deal with forensic. So it's called bad luck when you have to deal with that domain. So detection, protection is more important. So without going into anything technical here, my question to you is that what is the national policy of cyberspace security? I have spoken to a lot of people, and I know where they're coming from. But if you allow me to say this, Singapore has to be, because we are so small and so vulnerable, and you have to be ahead of time. Mm-hmm. Are we? In my opinion, no. in many people's opinion, also no. I'd like to hear your take. Thank you.
I'm afraid I am not going to be able to give a particularly detailed response to that, only because I haven't worked on cybersecurity policy in any great depth, and I don't want to make pronouncements for which I am not qualified. So I don't think I can give you any particular detail on that. I'm sorry, and I hope that you'll find other people who maybe have worked on those areas who will be able to give you a lot greater detail on it. The thing I would say in response to that question, though, is that we're not dealing only with technical issues, as you suggested, but actually, when we're dealing with cybersecurity, a lot of the work that needs to be done is in the realm of individual sets of values and how families watch for one another as well. I think, you're shaking your head, so maybe you disagree, but I think there's a perspective out there that's a valid one, which would suggest that in addition to all the protocols and the security measures that are out there, we need to also make sure that we are literate consumers of the information that's out there and that we take the necessary precautions for ourselves. So for instance, I don't think that pure consumption on the net is a useful thing. I think that we also need to be using the material out in cyberspace to create things, right, and to communicate with one another. And my personal heuristic is that if I'm using online resources for communication and for creation, that's a better thing to be doing than looking at it from a purely consumptive sort of perspective. That's one thing, and I would encourage parents to do that with children as well, because I think once you do that, you actually enable them to be much more discerning in how they spend their time, to go back to the theme of the conference, on the internet, and actually use that time in much more constructive ways. If we can, I probably don't want to take a follow-up on this, because like I said, I can't go into huge detail on the responses, but I do think that there are certain principles that we can use in how we live our lives to actually optimize the space that is offered to us online.
And it,
It's actually before you even consume.
Mm-hmm.
You have an identity in the cyberspace.
Yeah.
And that is actually a lot of things go into the policy maker. It's like I identify myself, but there's a national policy regarding this thing that I've just mentioned. And
right.
I guess you perhaps not so familiar.
I don't think I know enough detail on that front.
Yeah.
So I wish you well, and I hope you manage to find answers to those questions.
yes, there's a question over here.
Thank you, Aaron. It was a very interesting talk. I'd just like to ask you more about transcendental time, which you mentioned, whether you could comment on how that can be applied in public policy in general, and or if you have any thoughts about how it can be applied in education policy, the education of our young, especially in these disruptive times.
Yeah. It's an interesting question as well, because I would start by saying I think when we're dealing with any of these policy questions, there's always two ways in which the applications can happen. One is the way that I explored on that last slide, right, which is how we organize ourselves as a policy ecosystem to make certain decisions. And then the second is the actual content of the decisions themselves, right? And so on the first thing, I would say that if we're trying to understand better this idea of transcendental time, then the first thing we need to do is infuse it into the lives that we actually lead. Because transcendental time has many names, right? I use the term kairos. The organizational development thinker, Csikszentmihalyi, will say that it's all about flow, right? Because it's a time when you're so engrossed in a particular activity that you may not even realize that time is passing, or that chronological time is passing, because you are in that period of heightened awareness. And I think the more we can experience some of that, the more that means that we are in states where, in a sense, we are doing the thing for which we were put on the earth to do, right? That sounds very, very lofty, right? But it's really about realizing a sense of mission and vocation. And for me, some of that realization actually comes not just when I'm doing work that I really enjoy, but sometimes when it comes from complete detachment, when you sit down and say, all right, for 5 minutes, I'm just going to sit and breathe, right? And you may call that meditation, you might call that mindfulness practice. I think there are many names for it, but I think having those practices is actually very useful. Some people will do it through art, some will do it through other means like journaling or writing poetry or creative things like painting. But having something like that, I think, is important as individuals and as a system, because that helps us to be much more aware of ourselves and the interconnections that we have to the rest of the world. Secondly, is the question of education policy, as you asked about, right? I think one critical thing that comes from the insights of ideas like kairos and transcendental time is the idea that most of us have what we might like to call a calling or a vocation or a mission of some kind, right? And we may infuse that with religious significance, right? Some people will say this is what God put us on the earth to do. Others might just say that there is a humanistic view of that calling, right? It's the ways in which you use your gifts best to serve other people. I think a lot of education policy needs to be about helping us to do that. And our education policy has evolved quite a lot, right, in the 5 decades that we've existed. We started off with a very survivalist way of thinking about education, which was all about how do we man the workforce, how do we equip people with the skills that are necessary for Singapore and its economy to be relevant. And we've evolved now, I think, to a very different set of priorities, which I think is an evolution in the right direction. We don't have a perfect education system, but this is the right evolution to focus on the vocations and the missions and the callings that students have and help them to find those and help them to maximize their chances to develop that potential. Amartya Sen writes a lot about this when he talks about the capabilities approach to public policy. So public policy that doesn't just maximize its use of resources or optimize efficiency, but actually helps people to be the best that they can be and to lead flourishing lives. So I think that actually has a very direct connection to the idea of transcendental time, because it is in moments of transcendence that we actually fulfill that greatest purpose.
Virginia.
I'm not sure I have my question well formulated yet, but so when you develop policy, when you're doing policy making, you're basically thinking at the level of a population, of number of people.
Yeah.
I'm curious to which extent you take into account the inter-individual variability. So the inter-individual variability or the individuality of the people. For instance, what I mean is in chronobiology, we know that every single individual have different rhythms, for instance, right? And different. So to which extent the psychology of this might influence how we feel free, for instance, because of the policy that has been made, and how do we fit in terms of our timing with respect to this?
Yeah.
Is it taking into account?
Sure, that is such a rich question, and I think, in some ways, from an individual perspective, the ideal policy would be one that is utterly customized and particularized to us, right, and our personalities. But as large systems, we often find that there are certain rules that are in place as well. And I think one of the great tensions, but it's a creative tension and a good one, I think, is for policymakers to figure out ways to maximize that individuality while at the same time retaining a base level of fairness and free access for as many people as possible. So again, I think education systems that diversify the opportunities, for instance, and don't pigeonhole students into having to do only, say, lots of STEM, or lots of liberal arts, or do English language, but don't focus on other things. That, I think, would be much less useful, because you're not maximizing the gifts and the talents of the individual person. And when we create opportunities, I think what we're trying to do, certainly in the Singapore case, and I think in other great education systems like the Finns, what we're trying to have there is a situation where individuals can find, through education, what their actual gifts and aptitudes might be, and then fulfill those as best they can. So that's why we've set up things like schools for sports and specialized schools for arts and science education, because we recognize that the mainstream education may be great for a good number of people, but is not going to be great for some of the outliers who are there. That's the macro answer. But I think what's also necessary is for all of us in the teams that we're in to also find ways to respect the individual psychologies of the people that we work with. The program that I work on in government involves me moving around every few years. It's partly to learn about how the whole system works, but I think it's partly to keep us out of trouble as well. So just move you around before any major damage happens. And one thing I do when I join every new team is I sit down with each of my new team and I ask them a few different questions. I ask them things like what they like, what they don't like, what do they want me to change, what would they like me to keep constant. But I also ask them, what do I need to know about you that will help me be a better, hopefully more supportive boss? And I keep that question very open. Some will tell me often deeply psychological things about themselves. Not disturbing, but just how they operate, right? And the things that they find most useful. So some will tell me things like, actually, I don't work very well between 2 and 3, so I might actually have a nap some days, but I'm very effective after that. I'm happy to put in the hours later on. Other people will tell me things like, I'm happy to work very hard on most days, but on Thursdays I must leave at 5 because my kid has a piano lesson and I need to take her there because it's one of those things where the parent must learn together. And if I skip too many of those, my poor child is there by themselves and every other kid has their parents there. Others have told me things like, I was born deaf, I learned how to talk and hear based on the hearing aid that I started wearing 5 years ago. And each of those things I find very illuminating of the specific, particular human being in front of me. And I find that that's such an important question to ask. So I think we need both those very micro-level actions in teams of 10 or 20 or 30 or whatever, but we then need the macro sense of maximizing priorities for people as well. And if we can kind of juggle between the two, I suspect we'll have better systems than we do now. And I don't just mean for Singapore, I mean for any public policy system. Yeah.
All right, one last question. Maybe two last questions, if
Sure.
that is
Why don't
okay
we
with
take
you.
both and
But
then
first,
we can,
first
yeah.
the gentleman in the back.
Now, time is a resource like money, and the less we use, the better it is, and that's what many people seem to do. So trying to achieve more within limited time seems to be a mantra in business and economics. And in the case of Singapore, we also see that trying to achieve many things within limited time. Now, but at the same time, you did mention that there are situations where it's good to slow down. Where do you see, and what kind of situations, or where should Singapore slow down so that it can progress faster? Like the Japanese, there is a saying, when you go slow, you go fast. When you go fast, you go slow. There are situations when this applies.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And there was another one, right? Let's take both, yeah.
Time can take its toll. And I'm referring to, I think, a problem that may not be unique to Singapore, and namely sustainability of the population. With all these wonderful and deep, profound thoughts about time, is it possible to somehow put all these thoughts to bear on this question of population sustainability?
Could you say more about that? What exactly do you mean?
If you look at Singapore, right, is the population able to replace itself? What is the birth rate of Singapore? At that rate,
Yep.
can the population continue? Is this something of national importance, do you think?
Okay. Let me take the second question first. I think it's absolutely a question of national importance. And I think one of the greatest challenges is precisely what you pointed out, the fact that this is not a technical problem. You can't just say, let's have more babies, and then magically 1 year later, there's going to be more babies, right? Birth rates are functions functions of and determined by a huge range of complex things like emotions and psychological preferences and what people actually want. Some of it is a result of general modernization, right, as well. I mean, birth rates have gone down in pretty much every country that has modernized. And I think the questions we have to figure out for ourselves are, what are the deep sources of values that we have, and how do we slowly shift that? This is actually an example, I think, of maturation time, that Helga talked about, or maybe even of the cultural and attitudinal time that I mentioned on my slide. Because I don't think we can look at our fertility-related policies and say, oh, they have already failed forever. Some things didn't work, right? So things like pure incentives, giving out baby bonuses and all that, they have been insufficient so far. But I think we need to give ourselves a slightly longer runway if we accept that, if we want that cultural evolution to actually take place. Because cultures are not going to change even over a 10-year period. But I suspect if we keep at it with the transformation that we're looking to have, which is to emphasize the intrinsic value that children can have, right? And the joy that they bring to families. And we encourage that while at the same time addressing some of the pain points that people have about access to childcare and the stress related to schools and that sort of thing. If we can address that whole experience of being Singaporean, then I actually think if we give it, say, another 10 to 15 years, we might start seeing some dividends. The same way that even as they matured, some of the Nordic countries have now started to see upticks in their overall populations again, after an initial period of decline. Yeah. Then your question about slowing down. I'm not sure I agree, by the way, that time is a resource, because resources are by definition scarce. And yeah, I suppose time is, we all only have 24 hours a day. Pardon?
It's unique in the sense that it's
available. It is available, but also our perception of it changes, right? Yesterday, Peter Ho mentioned the Long Now Foundation, right? And one really interesting thing about the Long Now Foundation is they label years in 5 digits instead of 4. So they would tell you that today we are in March 02018 rather than 2018. And it's amazing what that small labeling can do, right? Because it effectively slows us down to suddenly realize, oh yeah, actually, right? I mean, the world has existed for a hugely long time before we started counting in these 4 digits anno domini, right? And we could go on lasting for a very long time. So I just think that reperception on their part was quite critical. And the reperception of slowness and fastness is something that we have to do for ourselves. It's not something that can be externally determined for us. But you asked, I think, a question about where exactly can we do some slowing down, right? I don't think it's an all or nothing slow down or speed up on specific areas. My thought, to go back to the idea of polarity management, right, is I actually hope Singapore finds a way to really go fast on the things that matter to it, right? So on certain aspects of growing the economy, for instance, keeping our manufacturing sector strong, harnessing the potential of the digital economy, I think we should go all out with that, right? And be as fast as we can and move quickly on that, while of course allowing for the fact that we might take some time for the full innovations to realize themselves, right? So on growth and on things, on major priorities like our overall well-being, I do think that speed is actually quite useful. Where I think we can afford to slow down a little bit more is in 2 areas. One is to toggle the time that we have for leisure and relaxation, rather than try and spend time with our families, but actually be on our cell phones all the time, trying to reply to emails even more. I think we actually go back to our work better if we give ourselves space to fully replenish ourselves, right? To go back to the idea of recovery time that I mentioned earlier. That is one area. The other is, if we want to truly innovate, then I think we need to slow down there as well. Because you cannot structure innovation. And you cannot structure creativity. I've just started a PhD, and the best advice I was given by my supervisor was not to fill up my diary. She told me, she said, Aaron, you're starting on this PhD from a big job. Your instinct is going to be to fill up your diary and meet lots of people, and you will give yourself the illusion that you're doing a lot of work. But if you do that, you will never finish the doctorate. And she is totally right. I mean, I still haven't finished the doctorate, right? But I hope that I'm inching towards it a bit more, because I had to basically grow the new muscle of just giving myself time for ideas to connect and gestate and to think. And if Singapore wants to do more innovation, then we need some of those white, slow spaces as well. Then we will be able to, once we get the ideas, start running faster with them. Yeah. But I think that's a very profound question, so thank you for asking it. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Aaron.
Thank you.
Please thank Aaron again.
Thank you.
Hold it.
Oh, right. Sorry, yes.
You're not off the hook yet.
Thing, yes.
Don't go, because I have something to say. This is an appreciation.
Thank you. Very kind of you. I think we should take a...
Oh, all right.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks. Thanks, yeah.